The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this important hearing this morning. And I do want to thank all the witnesses for testifying this morning. Mr. Roberts, if I could, my district is West Tennessee, so I've got the suburbs of Memphis and then West Tennessee and some rural parts of West Tennessee. Recently, I had the opportunity to speak to a roundtable of bankers from really all around my district, and one of the topics was around CRA modernization. One bank in my district told me that they were recently required to open up a branch really for CRA purposes, and that because of that, it's losing about $100,000 a year annually. As we look at the CRA and the way it's constructed and what's required of the different communities, it seems like that regulators increasingly have included in their CRA examinations criteria, in my opinion, that may not be related to CRA, including compliance with other financial laws or consumer regulations that have their own standards and penalties for violations. An example for banks in my district is that the banks are being subjected to fair lending questions during their CRA exams. With all that said, we've talked a lot this morning, and you all have talked a lot about modernization. How do you envision modernizing CRA to best suit the needs of the 21st century financial institutions and the communities that they serve, including some of these rural communities?
Yes, Mr. Kustoff, rural communities certainly need much better consideration under CRA. They're often overlooked in the CRA process because they are smaller than the larger cities, and so the examiners tend to focus more on them. But there are a number of things that could be done to remedy that.
And what are some of those areas?
One thing that we would suggest is that oftentimes rural areas need economic development. Mr. Foster had raised the anecdote of a town that loses its primary employer. And CRA should do much more to recognize economic development efforts in distressed communities, urban and rural. So that, and it's not just a numbers game. Even a small loan or investment can sometimes make a big difference in a small community, but it gets overlooked because of its size. So those are some of the things we would suggest.
Okay. I appreciate that. Lastly, if I could, revolves around financial literacy. And I do think that the banks in my communities do a pretty good job of trying to educate through financial literacy. And in fact, this week is Financial Literacy Week in Tennessee with our community banks. What I've heard from my banks is that unless financial literacy is done in very specific areas, it doesn't count towards those CRA requirements. Do you believe that these requirements should be or could be modernized, if you will, to allow for education done within a bank's footprint to be counted towards the CRA?
Yes, I think it could be done, and you can maintain faithfulness to the low and moderate income focus on CRA by simply taking a look at, what share of the broader community is low and moderate income, and provide pro rata credit for those broad activities based on that, so that you don't reject those activities entirely because they're not specifically targeted, but you recognize that a community that is, say, 40% low and moderate income is really benefiting in a different way from a community that is 10% low and moderate income.
Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.